No, it's wrong, but I have to admit that I cheated on my wife to do something crazy with his dad. Let me take you through the story to see how it went. It all started with the family gathering at our home, a routine tradition that was meant to be comfortable and familiar. The air was filled with the aroma of roasted chicken, garlic bread, and the faint sweetness of freshly baked apple pie. My wife, Victoria, had just invited her father, Frank, over for dinner. It was a casual gesture, nothing out of the ordinary, as Victoria often sought to strengthen the fragile relationship she had with her dad. Frank was an intriguing man, someone whose presence always commanded attention without much effort. With his silver hair combed neatly back, a posture that exuded confidence, and a deep, soothing voice, he was the kind of man who left an impression. There was a quiet intensity about him that could make any room feel smaller when he entered. That evening, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence in a way I hadn't before. Perhaps it was the way he smiled when he complimented the meal I had prepared, or how his eyes lingered on mine a moment too long when I poured him a second glass of wine. It felt harmless, a moment of shared recognition that I quickly dismissed. As the night unfolded, we sat around the dining table laughing over Victoria's stories about her college days and Frank's dry humor that often left us in stitches. I couldn't help but notice the ease with which Frank carried himself. His wit was sharp but never overbearing. There was a way he listened, really listened, that made you feel like the most important person in the world, even in a crowded room. After dinner, Victoria disappeared into the den to finish something, leaving Frank and me alone in the kitchen. I tried to busy myself, but I could feel Frank's gaze on me. "You've outdone yourself tonight," he said, breaking the quiet. His voice was warm, genuine, but there was a flicker of something else there, something I wasn't ready to name. "Thank you," I replied, glancing at him over my shoulder. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. You've been good for Victoria," he added, stepping closer. "She's lucky to have someone who grounds her." I smiled politely, unsure how to respond. "We make it work," I said softly, my hands busy drying a glass. Frank leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "Marriage isn't easy, trust me. I've learned that the hard way." There was a weight to his words that made me pause. I set the glass down and turned to face him fully. "You seem like you've figured out a lot, though," I offered. "You carry yourself with so much confidence." He chuckled, the sound low and rich. "That comes with age, or maybe it's just the ability to hide insecurities better than most." The way he said it made me feel like he was letting me in on a secret, and I found myself smiling in return. There was an undeniable magnetism about him, a pull I couldn't quite shake. The next message came before I could respond. "If you're free sometime, I'd love to continue our conversation. There's so much more I'd like to hear about you." I stared at the screen, the weight of his words sinking in. My first instinct was to brush it off, to chalk it up to harmless curiosity or polite small talk. But the part of me that had felt so invisible in recent years clung to the attention like a lifeline. "Sure, that sounds nice," I replied, before I could overthink it. His response came quickly. "Tomorrow afternoon, I know a quiet cafe near the park where we could talk without interruptions." I hesitated, meeting him felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I wanted to approach. But the allure of being seen, truly seen, was too strong to resist. I found myself typing, "Tomorrow works, see you then." The cafe was cozy. I had a conversation like this too, I admitted, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, his hand hovering near mine as if he wanted to reach out but thought better of it. "Maybe we could do this again sometime," he said. Nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'd like that." As I walked away, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of what had just transpired. I told myself it was just a friendly meeting, but deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I could stop it or if I even wanted to. But I was so unaware of what would still come. The days leading up to our next meeting were filled with a restless energy I couldn't shake. I busied myself with the usual chores, laundry, errands, dinner planning, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying moments from the cafe, the way Frank's gaze had lingered, the warmth in his words, and the subtle spark that seemed to pass between us. It wasn't just the conversation that had stayed with me. It was how he made me feel, seen, heard, important. When Frank suggested another meeting, this time at his house, I didn't hesitate. It felt inevitable. It felt like a continuation of something we'd only just begun to explore. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a pull that neither of us seemed able or willing to resist. The drive to his house was both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. My thoughts raced with possibilities, with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. When I finally pulled into his driveway, I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the familiar house. It had always been a warm, welcoming place, but tonight it felt different. The air around it seemed heavier, like it was holding secrets within its walls. Frank opened the door almost immediately after I knocked, his expression soft but tinged with something I couldn't quite place, relief, anticipation. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind," he said, his lips curving into a smile that made my heart skip. "Just needed a moment to collect myself," I admitted, offering a shaky laugh. He stepped aside to let me in, and as I crossed the threshold, the familiar scent of cedarwood mixed with something faintly spicy, his cologne, washed over me. It felt comforting and disarming all at once. We made small talk as he led me through the house, his voice steady but warm. It was a facade we both clung to, pretending this was just another visit, that the undercurrent between us didn't exist. When we reached the kitchen, he gestured toward the island. "Sit," he said. "I'll make us some coffee." I obeyed, slipping onto one of the high stools as he moved around the kitchen. The space was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, the light streaming through the windows and reflecting off the polished countertops. It felt intimate in a way that caught me off guard. "Still take it with cream and no sugar?" he asked over his shoulder. "You remembered." "Hard to forget," he said simply, his tone carrying a weight I couldn't ignore. As he set a steaming mug in front of me, our fingers brushed briefly. The touch was fleeting but electric, sending a jolt through me that I struggled to suppress. I wrapped my hands around the mug, more for something to do than for warmth, and avoided his gaze. "This feels strange," I admitted, finally breaking the silence. "Strange how?" His voice was soft, inviting me to open up. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Like we're walking a fine line, one we probably shouldn't be walking." Frank leaned against the counter, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're not wrong," he said after a moment. "But does that mean it's something we shouldn't explore?" His honesty took me off guard, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at him. The weight of his question hung between us, heavy and undeniable. "I don't know," I whispered. "But I can't seem to walk away." His lips twitched into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Neither can I." The air between us grew thicker, charged with unspoken emotions and tension that was impossible to ignore. I sipped my coffee, though the taste barely registered, my mind too focused on the man standing a few feet away. "I never asked," Frank said, breaking the stillness. "What drew you to Victoria in the first place?" His question caught me off guard, as though he had already asked it, and I took a moment to think before answering. She was different back then. It felt like we could conquer the world together, and I wanted to be part of that. Frank nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And now?" "Now," I said with a sigh, "it feels like we're just existing. We're in the same house, but it's like we're living separate lives. She's always working, always distracted. I don't even remember the last time she really looked at me." Frank's expression softened, and he turned to face me. "You deserve to be seen, to be valued. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not worth that." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I looked at him, my chest tightening as the unspoken tension between us grew. Frank, I began, but he reached out, his hand covering mine. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. I just want you to know that if you ever need someone, I'm here. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for a moment, I let myself believe it. His hand was warm against mine, his touch grounding and steady. My instinct screamed at me to pull away, to draw the line before it blurred any further, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I turned my hand over, letting our fingers intertwine. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it felt monumental. Frank's eyes searched mine, and in that moment, something shifted. You're not alone in this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The world around us seemed to fade, the soft rustling of leaves and distant chirping of birds blending into a quiet symphony that seemed to exist solely for us. My breath hitched as he leaned in, his face inches from mine. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was tentative, almost hesitant, as if he was giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. When his lips met mine, it was soft and deliberate, a kiss that spoke of longing and understanding. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The kiss lingered, a tender yet electrifying connection that neither of us seemed ready to break. Frank's hand slid up to cradle my face, his thumb brushing my cheek with a gentleness that made my heart ache. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched like this, not out of obligation or routine, but with genuine care and desire. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths mingled in the stillness between us. His forehead rested lightly against mine, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't quite name. I shouldn't have. As I pulled him closer, my fingers threaded through his hair. The kiss that followed was different, not urgent or rushed, but filled with a quiet intensity that left no room for doubt. The world around us seemed to blur, time stretching and folding in on itself as we surrendered to the connection between us. His hands moved with careful confidence, tracing paths along my skin that made me feel more alive than I had in years. Every kiss, every touch was a promise, a silent declaration of something neither of us dared to put into words. When he finally pulled back, his breathing was ragged, his eyes searching mine as though trying to decipher what I was thinking. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and full of concern. I nodded, unable to find the words to articulate the storm of emotion swirling inside me. Instead, I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against his, and letting the silence speak for me. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close as we stood there, lost in the moment. I was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes when I felt him enter the room. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his presence heavy in the air. I kept my eyes on the soapy water, the rhythmic clink of plates against the sink the only sound. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, his voice soft. I set down the dish I was holding, letting the water drip from my hands. "I don't know," I said honestly, not turning to face him. "I'm trying to be." He moved closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his tone hesitant. "About everything." I closed my eyes, bracing myself for what was coming. And I think you're right," he said after a pause. "About how complicated this is. About what's at stake." I turned then, drying my hands on a dish towel as I met his gaze. My days passed as if on autopilot, a ghost in my own life, tethered to a reality I no longer fully recognized. At home, Victoria remained blissfully unaware. Her obliviousness was almost cruel in its irony. She continued to smile at me with the same ease as always, to ask me about my day as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had changed. Frank and I spoke less after that night in the kitchen. It was a silent agreement, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever had begun between us couldn't continue, not like that. He avoided lingering in the same room as me for too long, and I did the same. But even in his absence, I felt him everywhere, in the echo of his voice, the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the hallway, the way his gaze had burned into me in that charged moment before we'd stepped apart. The guilt was suffocating, Not just guilt for what I'd done to my wife, but guilt for the way I still thought about Frank, how I replayed every touch, every whispered word, every stolen moment, Frank, about the way his voice had sounded that night when he told me he didn't regret a single moment. Did I regret it? I asked myself the question over and over, and the answer was never clear. Part of me wanted to scream yes, to wish it all away and erase the chaos it had brought into my life. But another part of me, the part one was most afraid to acknowledge, held on to it, held on to the way he'd made me feel alive, seen, understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. I sighed, tilting my head back to watch the stars as they began to appear one by one. Maybe there was no answer. Maybe there never would be. What I did know was that I couldn't keep living like this, trapped between two lives, two versions of myself. I needed to find a way forward, whatever that looked like. As I sat there in the dark, the sound of crickets filling the silence, I made a promise to myself, not to forget, because forgetting wasn't possible, but to move forward, to take each day as it came, and figure out who I wanted to be on the other side of this. Maybe it would mean rebuilding my marriage. Maybe it would mean starting over. Or maybe it would mean something entirely different. But for now, all I could do was breathe, one moment at a time. What do you think of all this? Is it wrong, what I did? Should I stop doing it? Should I tell Victoria? I don't know. Please help me. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories.